Hi, and welcome to Virtual Coffee Season 3 special episodes. Today, we kick off a new season dedicated to climate change and food of the future. Today's episode is based on Our Changing Menu, a book about climate change, the food we love and need. We have today two of the authors, Professor Mike Hoffmann from Cornell University and Dr. Danielle Eiseman, also from Cornell University. I hope you enjoyed this and you increase your science literacy through the wonderful stories they're going to share with us in the way they wrote this wonderful book. By the way, this amazing book about climate change and food is available on Amazon with a special discount for a limited time. Enjoy.
Both want to emphasize that there are thousands of people around the world looking for solutions. And with this great challenge, and sometimes you can look at it as opportunities for research, for new practices, for new business, better business practices, et cetera, to stay in, just frankly, stay in business. So I'll start with what farmers are doing, and we refer to them as stewards of the land. There's a lot of opportunities to go further, but a lot of what farmers are doing is also called it's simply common sense or climate smart agriculture. So the biggest focus is on the soil. I think everybody realizes the soil is critical, has to be maintained. It also is capable of storing enormous amounts of carbon if managed correctly. And some think that soil could actually tip the whole climate change issue a little bit more positive if soil is managed as well as possible. But without good soil, you don't have a crop. So soil health is at the top of the list of many of those who grow our food. Water would be another one. Adopting better practices for irrigation, drip irrigation. There are now tools out there developed by scientists that actually it's like a little chip. You insert it into the plant like a great plant, and it actually will determine exactly the water status of that individual plant, and therefore you can irrigate accordingly. You're not going to waste any water. You're going to just provide that plant what it needs. Another thing I'll call them catchment basins. Essentially, when it rains, a pond fills up, and then you can tap that water later. In our research, I also discovered that a lot of farms are using, especially out in the prairie, solar-powered water pumps. Rather than using fuel of some sort, they actually use solar panels to power the electric pump that keeps the water available to the cattle. New pests are moving north. Some are getting worse because of climate change, some less so. But farmers try to do that using something called integrated pest management and using all kinds of factors to control the pest. But if ultimately needed, maybe a pesticide has to be applied. Another important one is diversification. If you're growing one crop and it's wiped out by climate change, there goes your income. But can you grow multiple crops? So if you lose a few, you still have some others there to provide an income. If one is growing livestock, milk cows or beef animals, the heat can take a toll. So they're using misters, they're using shade and so on to make sure the animals continue to be comfortable and productive. And lastly, this might be hard for all of us, but long-term planning. What's it going to be like in 10, 20 years? When do I need to invest in irrigation as a farmer? So that's another way those who grow our food are staying in business and helping us keep that menu supplied. Food businesses. Danielle, do you have any, you want to share some ideas of what they might be doing?
Sure. So a lot of food businesses are starting to really pay attention to what's happening, especially across supply chains. I think the events of especially the last 2 years have really shown that there are significant risks to the supply chain, whether it's an extreme weather event or a global pandemic that limits the amount of workers that can come and work within the supply chain. So companies are starting to conduct supply chain risk assessments and think about not just one backup in the supply chain for sourcing ingredients or products, but multiple backups within the supply chain for sourcing ingredients and products. A lot of big companies, especially Starbucks and Nestle, are investing in suppliers in terms of their farming production practices to ensure that their soil health is maintained and that they're using best management practices on their farms, so that these companies are ensuring that their suppliers, all the way down to the farmers, are maintaining their productivity and their resiliency to any kind of shock that may occur within the supply chain. And there's also a lot of pressure from some of the big corporations, for instance, Walmart, that is really pushing for climate smart farming practices. And so again, these big corporations like Starbucks and Nestle and Walmart are really spending a lot of time and working with farmers to make sure that they are maintaining their productivity and doing so in a way that aligns with climate smart agriculture practices. And then looking internally at business assets and looking at ways at which they could mitigate their impact on climate, whether it's energy efficiency or transportation, the way that they cool products. There's, for instance, one company in Chicago called Testa Produce, and they have one of the most aggressive carbon mitigation plans in their warehouse. So they built this whole new plant several years ago where they use renewable energy for their refrigerators and their freezers. They have low emission vehicles that transport food, and they will only deliver food within 250 miles of their warehouse to limit the emissions from transportation, already more so than their low emissions vehicles. They also put in permeable pavements in their parking lot, so that makes sure that rainwater is collected instead of just going off into the sewer. So there's a lot of great examples of companies that are taking this issue seriously and really thinking in a very forward way and how they can have an impact and reduce climate change impacts.
And one example, or another example, is some companies are actually looking at alternative ingredients because the raw product may not be available. And I'm okay with that as long as they don't find a replacement for chocolate. We can go on to scientists and what they're doing. Again, around the world, there are thousands of scientists taking on this challenge, and but at the top of the list is more resilient, climate resilient crops that are drought resistant, heat resistant, maybe salt tolerant. A lot of work. There's a team that's partnered up with between Costa Rica and, of all places, the UK on better cacao. They have a huge collection of germplasm, and they're tapping into that to develop more resilient cacao plants. Although a topic to some is, this is controversial, I think genetic engineering has a really important role in developing new crops. And the science tells us, at least from a human consumption standpoint, there are other issues, that the consumption of genetically engineered crop poses no more risk than one that is developed by traditional breeding mechanisms. So we have to keep our mind open, especially as the demand for food increases, that this is an option we need to consider. There's a lot of scientists, again, looking at soil health, how to help farmers come up with the best practices. There are also efforts to develop new, we'll call them management tools, that can help farmers more precisely determine when to irrigate or not to irrigate, when to buy that equipment. The climate modelers are helping predict what the conditions will be out in the future. So again, those in the business of growing food can adapt. So there's a lot of activity on the science side, including things like how to communicate about it. We really need, all of us need to be able to talk about this issue, and there are ways to do it and not ways to do it. And this is something that Danielle does in part, is how to help all of us engage in these kind of dialogues. So there's a long list of efforts in the science community to help address climate change. Let's put it this way, we can all do something. And these may be the small things, recycling, compost, but bear in mind, those are the small things. It's a good starting point, but from there we've got to go think much bigger. And some of the suggestions we make include, make sure you understand climate change. We call it become climate change literate. Understands the cause, the symptoms we're seeing, why it's happening, so that you can articulate that. What are the impacts of climate change? But bottom line, be informed so that you can make good decisions, wherever that decision might place you, whether it's directing a message to a policymaker or shopping, but being adequately informed so that you can make good, common sense and well-informed climate change decisions. I'll take one more. There are experts out there in the world that think one of the most important things we can do is simply talk about it. In the US, 2/3 of the population rarely talk about climate change, yet it's this enormous issue that we face. But the idea is to make it more of a social norm, so we're not afraid to talk about it, make it part of our daily dialogue, etc. Again, some very smart people think this is the place we should all start with. And there are ways to do it and ways not to do it. And we can some other time go into the details of how to best approach this topic. But there are ways, there's a lot of literature out there and information in the popular press on how to go ahead and have this dialogue. At this point, I'm sure Danielle has some great ideas on what we can all do as well.
Well, again, another way that people can have an impact within their own life that's pretty simple to do is to consider a more plant-based diet. So, cutting back on meat and treating it a bit more of a luxury as opposed to a staple when it comes to their daily eating habits. Also, learning more about their personal carbon footprint and think about ways that they could reduce it. There's a lot of things that we do in our daily life that can easily be adjusted in a way that reduces a carbon footprint, whether it's choosing more natural-based clothing or deciding to bike or walk somewhere as opposed to driving. Considering alternative forms of transportation, such as taking a train or a bus instead of driving or flying. And then also just getting involved at the local level, getting involved with a community group and really push back on some of the policies that are being decided on by policymakers and voting for people that will work hard to make sure that environmentally friendly practices and policies are put in place.
And if I could add one thing, so maybe close to an exact quote of Greta Thunberg, the youth climate change leader, who weighs all of a little over 100 pounds. And she basically says, you're never too small to make a difference.
We already have a lot of the technologies and the solutions necessary to ensure that we don't reach that tipping point of over 2 degrees Celsius in terms of average global warming. It's just that we get in our own way, and we are, because of I think the politics around some of the solutions, and that's been a huge barrier, as well as some of the the lack of understanding or the lack of climate change literacy from the public that maybe has been less than supportive of some of those policies as well. Mike?
There are, climate change is going to happen. It's already happening, and we're on a trajectory. We're just trying to, at this point, soften the impact it has on us, And there are some scientists, and I do agree with them, that could actually stabilize this whole system in the next 20 to 30 years. That stabilize it at not a good place, but it's not going to get any worse. And that's a massive shift away from fossil fuels. Social movements such that we're all talking about climate change, we're all in this together, we join forces, etc., and we can make a difference. But doing it sort of in unity, that's a huge challenge, but that can make a difference. Is there hope? Well, let me back up just a little bit. And it goes back to, can we all do something? So it's also, there's a real personal side to all of this. I think many of us have children, maybe even grandchildren. And I guess at some point, all I want them to know is their dad tried, rather than sat there in front of the television and did nothing. So is there hope? If you give up hope, my personal opinion, you're kind of useless. And you can be doing something. And I think those of us who sometimes fall into despair, the way to get out of that is to do something and to act. So again, I think joining forces, we can mitigate the ultimate impact climate change hands on us. It's here, it's going to get worse before we stabilize systems. So I do see hope, but there's a rough road ahead.
My take-home message would be that hopefully people recognize that technology and policies alone won't solve the problem of climate change, that we need people to get involved.
Mine is, I've said this before, but all of us have capacity to do great things, much better than I'll leave it that way. We all have capacity to do something, and we can actually do great things if we really try. And I think this is the time to look deep into each of us, into our hearts and souls, and ask the question, what can I do? And that goes back to, it's time to find your greater purpose. And if you want something that can give you purpose, it's trying to tackle climate change. So I'll leave it with that. Find your greater purpose.
Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Look forward to seeing you again in our next episode.